Ladies and gentlemen, up and down the comfortably zoned radio network, all of the stations coast to coast, I am so pleased today to be joined by this gentleman whom I have come to know over the past several years. His name is George Case Jr. He is the son of a Major League Baseball player, George Case, who played during the wartime years. George is, by career, was in the athletic footwear industry. He is the former executive director of SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research. And George is really a wonderful guy, has his own show on this network known as In Case You Were Wondering. And we have a lot of, shall we say, commonality when we speak, even though George goes back to when this was actually happening as a participant. And I have this interest in wartime ball and old-time ball, and we're going to be sharing a lot today. So, George, I'm so pleased to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm looking forward to it, and it'll be a nice conversation. So go ahead and fire away and see what we can do.
Now, I'm trying, this morning I was studying wartime baseball and the whole idea of, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt forever making this indelible impression upon us all, a date which will live in infamy, certainly. And then, as I understand it, the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, went to him and said, could we still play baseball? And President Roosevelt said, sure. Can you fill us in a little on that?
Okay, Tony, yeah, I'll be happy to. And basically, that is the story. Now, a little bit deeper part of it is that Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and some people have said to me, well, they think that possibly Clark Griffith of the Washington Senators, who was a personal friend of FDR's, had actually written a letter, but it became known when Roosevelt wrote his letter, the green light letter, to continue baseball. As long as baseball, the players were subject to the same draft situation as anyone else, and there were certain restrictions placed on wartime travel and that kind of thing. But the Franklin Roosevelt played a very important part because the owners of Major League Baseball, they were ready to shut down. And they felt that, because of the war, there was so much sentiment, obviously, with Pearl Harbor and the beginning of World War II, that baseball should shut down. But on the other hand, FDR felt that for a morale boost to not only the players, but to the millions of fans and people working in the factories, that the continuation of Major League Baseball would really be a morale boost for the rest of the country. So the so-called green light letter gave the okay to Major League Baseball to keep playing during World War II.
Now, as far as the pattern of players, I was born in the 50s, so I have to rely on what I've read, what I've seen. A number of major leaguers went into the service, but did things like play service ball and do appearances and things like that. A number of players, several players actually, a smaller number actually fought in the war, as far as Ted Williams, I understand, at least what I have been told, didn't fight in World War II, but fought in Korea. He was training fighter pilots during World War II.
Yeah, that's right, Tony. Ted Williams was a flight instructor in the Marine Corps of World War II, so he never saw actual combat in World War II. He did see combat in the Korean War. Matter of fact, he almost lost his life. He was shot, hit by enemy ground fire, and had to crash land his plane. And astronaut John Glenn of the astronaut corps, it just so happened that he and Ted Williams were very friendly, and John Glenn was Ted Williams' wingman. So Glenn helped Williams get back to the base, and he crash landed his plane, jumped out, and after the plane had exploded, and Williams' life was saved. But during World War II, you're absolutely correct. There were certain players that did face combat, and Bob Feller was one of them. He was an anti-aircraft gunner on the USS Alabama. Hank Greenberg was a forward spotter in the Army Air Force. Players like Buddy Lewis and Cecil Travis of Washington, they actually faced combat. Cecil Travis had his feet frozen in the Battle of the Bulge, and Buddy Lewis flew over the hump in Burma. So there were players that really was almost like the luck of the draw. Some of them did face combat. Some of them, were in, as you say, playing service ball. But it really depended, and it just so happened that some players, like my dad, and I know you were also someone who knew Tommy Holmes with the Boston Braves.
Right.
They were declared 4F because of a certain, physical ailment. My dad had a separated shoulder, so he would go before the draft board 3 or 4 times, was 4F. I think Tommy Holmes had a bad sinus or asthma condition. So there were players during World War II that were major league caliber players, stars, that still were allowed to play. But many of the players were, called up and did serve in World War II. I know Washington probably had 7 or 8 players, and one in particular, Elmer Layton, he was a 1939. Elmer Gedian was a 1939 player on the Washington Senators roster. He and my dad were teammates, but Elmer and my dad never played in the outfield together. But Elmer was killed in World War II when his plane was shot down over Germany. So, I mean, there was a real risk. There were players who were, prisoners of war in Germany. Bert Shepard was a fighter pilot. He was shot down, came back, was a German prisoner of war, was repatriated, and came back to pitch in the major leagues in one game against the Boston Red Sox. So there were players that were, major league caliber, very good players, but World War II certainly had a dramatic effect on their careers.
Well, I do understand that Augie Donatelli, the ump, was taken prisoner by the Germans, and he actually started to learn umpiring by arranging baseball games in the prison camp. And, they would play officers versus enlisted or German versus, United States or whatever. And he actually took that out of there and, started to become an umpire.
Well, you know what? That's really interesting, Tony. I did not know that, but I can certainly understand it. Zeke Benora, who you probably remember the name. He
yes.
was, a big slugger with the Chicago White Sox in Washington. And Zeke, was really a good hitter, not much in the field. But he, during World War II, he was actually decorated by General Eisenhower for his effort in building ball fields and supplying equipment for the troops, because it was, again, a morale boost. And what you're saying about Donatelli, I mean, I can certainly understand that. There were other players who did escape from, German POW camps or repatriated. So it had a dramatic effect, no question. And the umpire, that was an interesting story. I hadn't heard that before, but I can certainly understand that happening.
And it just goes to show you the universality of baseball. Now, to talk about your dad, who we look and, Tommy Holmes, whom I knew somewhat, although not well. Tommy was the community director liaison for the New York Mets for many years. So I tell all the kids that there was a time in baseball when the Mets would play the Yankees in a charity game every year, not for money, known as the Mayor's Trophy game, and all of the gate proceeds from that game would go to buy bats and balls for all the poor kids in the New York metropolitan area, you happen to be talking to one, who couldn't otherwise afford bats and balls and learn to play this game. And when I would call Shea Stadium every year, I would be speaking to Mr. Holmes, who was really one of the nicest, finest gentlemen you were ever going to meet. He knew my brother. He would ask about things. He was just, and the man just dripped baseball knowledge. He was just, really just a great gentleman of the game. But you think of him, you think of your dad, and you think of so many players that they have that, I'm going to use the word, tag wartime player, and they're really kind of shuttled off to the back of the historical parade. I mean, that's my take. I'm sure yours is probably a lot more acute than mine would be.
Well, I do want to comment on that, Tony, because you're right. I mean, I think players, they get lumped in, and the press, they talk about, World War II era baseball and the diminished talent. But there were a lot of players, and Tommy Holmes was one of them. My dad was one of them. Luke Appling was playing. I mean, there were quite a few that were playing. Hal Newhouser, Hall of Famer, and Appling, Hall of Famer. They played during the war. But they were declared 4F. So I mean that was a fact of life. Players, my dad would go to the draft board every year, and he'd be turned down. I mean that was just he wanted to be serving his country, and his country said, hey George, you're not fit to serve. So therefore, what you had to do, if you were declared 4F, you had to work in a defense-related industry in the off-season, which is what my dad did in Trenton, New Jersey. He was building Avenger fighter bombers. So that was his wartime job in the off-season, and then, of course, he was still allowed to play, during the regular season. The other thing that happened during that time, and a lot of people really are not aware of it, but players and teams did not go to spring training the way they did back.
Oh, yes. Tell us about that.
Right. Washington, because of travel restrictions, they were fortunate because they were able to travel and train at the University of Maryland, which was only a few miles from D.C. But there were a lot of teams, the northern teams, the Yankees, the Braves, Red Sox, that kind of thing, Giants. They had to train in New England. And there's a book called Spartan Seasons, which was about World War II era baseball, and there's photographs of these players, for instance, at Bear Mountain State, New York, throwing snowballs and being, their batting instructor was a ski instructor.
It's amazing. I remember seeing those movies of Leo DeRocher hitting grounders in the snow.
Right. Exactly. Yep. That's what they did. They had to, they were thankful to be playing, but the conditions, were certainly not ideal to train for baseball. Although, like I say, Washington was lucky because they were able to train at the University of Maryland, so when the weather was bad, they could be inside. But, they were close, and this was, I think, in 43, 44, 45, 3 of those war years, because of the travel restrictions. The deal with Major League Baseball is that the Major League teams had to, train close to their Major League city. So that's where Washington certainly benefited by their location and proximity to the University of Maryland.
It's really, just such you look back from today's perspective going back, it's absolutely unbelievable. Like a few years back, and I'm advancing a war here into the Korean War when Bob Lazari and I spoke with Dr. Bobby Brown, just a remarkable man and just so accomplished and one of the nicest, most decent people you're ever going to meet. And to actually be called away in the middle of a season into a combat theater to serve, can you imagine what would happen today? I can't fathom that.
Right. Tony, I agree with you. It's a different world. The players back then, they expected to serve their country first, play baseball second. Now, if they were, benefit of the 4F classification, obviously they were able to play. But when you mentioned Bobby Brown, now there's a perfect example. Bobby Brown, cardiologist, tremendous player, served his country, served as the president of the American League. He had wonderful credentials, but there were a lot of those players, that type of player, who their experiences in World War II and Major League Baseball, they wouldn't trade it for anything. And yet, when you talk to them, you're talking to real, sincere people. And you mentioned Tommy Holmes, great guy. Bobby Brown, great guy. My dad, a lot of people have said to me, boy, your dad was just a wonderful person.
Mm-hmm.
They were real, down-to-earth people. They would go to the ballpark. They knew the fans. Sometimes they would travel on the same trains, buses, trolleys, subways, carpool, that kind of thing. They were part of the community, and it's a lot different, I think, than what it is today when they've got their agents and they've got these multi-million-dollar contracts. That's something that back then, to give you an example, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Mantle, Stan Musial, that caliber of player, they were making contract $100,000 a year, and people thought that was just crazy. Well, look what you have today. You've got a minor league or first-year player just up in the minor leagues. Minimum contract is $550,000.
It's $500,000
before they've played one inning of one game.
And it's really something. I tried. Unfortunately, he was starting to fail physically, but we had a gentleman in Connecticut, Mike Sandlock, who passed on. I believe he was 101. He was a Brooklyn Dodger and Boston Brave reserve catcher, and his son was telling me his routine for when he played in Brooklyn. He lived in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. He would get on the commuter train, would go into Grand Central, would do whatever configuration of subways that he would have to do to get out to Ebbets Field. And he didn't play much. He played occasionally. And then he and Red Barber would take a subway back to Grand Central Station, share a beer at the bar, and then the man would go home.
Tony, I can understand that. Believe me. When my dad was playing, to give you an example of exactly what you're talking about, we lived in College Park, Maryland during baseball season, and our next door neighbor was Early Wynn, Hall of Famer. I grew up with Early Wynn's son, Joe Early, and Early Wynn and my dad would carpool to Griffith Stadium, and my mother and myself and Early Wynn's son and his mother, we would take a trolley from College Park, Maryland, down to Griffith Stadium and watch the ball game, and then wait for the husband to be through in the locker room getting the clothes and that kind of thing. Get in the car and drive back home. That's what we did. And I've had people say to me also, they said, "Hey, I remember riding on a subway with Whitey Ford or somebody from the Yankees going up to Yankee Stadium." That's just the way. And Gil Hodges and Jackie Robinson and Reese and all those guys, they lived in Brooklyn. They were part of the neighborhood.
And I think baseball really misses that type of thing. Years back, I remember talking with a member of the Jacuzzi family who went to Christian Brothers High School with Stan Musial's children. And Stan would have a routine. Stan was a big family guy and made sure everybody was having breakfast and at the table, and Stan would read the newspaper, and I don't know if Stan read the front page back or back page forward, but anyway, Stan did read the newspaper. I'm sure he spent some time in the sports section, and he would have a cardigan sweater and a pipe, and he had a steel gray-blue Cadillac, and he'd put the kids in the Cadillac. He would take them to Christian Brothers High School. And he would make sure he'd get there early because the kids would get out, and all the St. Louis kids or the kids in the school would come and talk to Stan. He wanted to be called Stosh. You don't call him Stan. And he would have a pipe, and he would listen to all of the comments the kids had about the game. And, gee, Stan, why did Hemus put you up against the lefties? Like, gee, I think I ought to tell him that. But he made these kids really feel like they were, part of the St. Louis Cardinals. And the bell would ring, and the priests and nuns would come out. He talked to them. It's like, and it kind of troubles me. This generation is not going to have that kind of camaraderie with our heroes.
Well, you know what? I agree with that, Tony. I'll give you an example. What you're talking about was Stan Musial. When I was in probably 9th or 10th grade, I remember making a comment. I'm in school, and I told some of my friends, I said, well, Mickey Vernon's coming over tonight for dinner. And I just happened to be an offhand comment. Well, this was in 1953. Mickey had just won the American League batting title. So all of a sudden, that night, Mickey's having dinner, his wife and Mickey and my mother and myself and my dad, and all of a sudden the doorbell starts ringing. And my dad and Mickey started laughing. There's a line of kids out front to get Mickey Vernon's autograph because I told my friends that Mickey Vernon was going to be at our house. Well, my dad said to me, he said, okay, you did it. Now you be the gatekeeper. So I had to let one kid in at a time to get Mickey Vernon's autograph. I mean, but that, again, because the players, and they say, "Oh my gosh, Mickey Burnham." I mean, Mickey Burnham was a major league star.
Yes.
And here he is, at Case's house having dinner, and these kids are getting his autograph. So I understand completely what you're talking about with regard to Stan Musial.
And I think of my good dear friend Rich Marazzi, the Major League Rules expert and author, and actually the one that got me started in this crazy business, many years ago on WICC in Bridgeport. And Rich is a huge Rocky Colavito fan. Don't knock the Rock, Rich always says. But Rocky Colavito had this routine where he would come out of the out into the street after a game, always very neatly dressed, and Rocky's a very handsome man, and kids would mob him, and he'd be like, "Okay, I'll sign for each and every one of you, but you've got to make a line, and you've got to be polite, and I will not do it any other way." And these kids would stand almost like church mice as Colavito signed an autograph for them one by one.
That's a great story, Tony. Absolutely great story. And the players back then, I mean, I can tell you, and not only World War II, but Colavito played in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, they were part of the community, but they were all very well dressed, and they would do that with kids. And a later example of the autograph, and I always admired him because he was really a throwback to the player that he broke, Lou Gehrig's record, was Cal Ripken.
Yes.
Ripken would stay after a game and he'd sign as much as he could. Where many players today, and I've had people say to me, "Said that doggone guy, he's a no good, whatever." I wanted to get an autograph for my son and he wouldn't do it. And the reason he wouldn't do it was because there was no money involved. So it's a different world today. The players back then, and I know my dad, when he would sign fan mail, I mean, his last couple of years he wasn't feeling well, and I would sit at the dining room table and I'd help. I said, "Dad, let me help you with the, open the envelopes and that kind of stuff." And people would send him money, and my dad would sign his autograph and send the money back to the people because he said, "I'm never going to charge anybody for my autograph. I'm thrilled that they were even remembering me and asking for my autograph."
Well, no, I can understand that. I remember I was a teenager. I think this was 1971. I was at an extra innings Met game, and Bob Aspromani was a member of the New York Mets, and Bob was like Gil Hodges' boy. Absolutely loved Gil, and I think Gil made a roster spot for him. Bob was a fine player, but was kind of getting towards the end. Anyway, Bob comes up as a pinch hitter and strikes out to end the game. And at the end of the game, we're walking out, and there's a very handsome man in a cardigan sweater. Seems like all the good guys wear cardigan sweaters. And he's signing autographs. And I happened to say to someone, I'm holding a program, I said, "Who is that player?" I said, "Well, that's Bob Aspromani." And he's signing autographs. He said, "How would you like me to do this?" Handing the program, "Thank you very much. May I have yours?" And the man was so polite. And then this pile of kids just like leaves, kids and adults. And Bob Aspromani looks at me and he says, "May I sign your program?" And it's like, "Yeah, sure, here, And he signs, "What's your name?" "Oh, my name is Tony, and I came from Stanford." "To Tony from Stanford, thanks for coming to see me play tonight. Bob Aspromani." He hands it back to me and says, "Thank you for coming to see me play tonight." Now I'm thinking, if I struck out to end the game in front of 30,000 people, my next stop is the Whitestone Bridge. It's like, this man was so classy.
I'd say, a lot of players, they were happy to sign if they had a good game, but if they had a bad game, they weren't that happy. But in that case with Aspromani, I mean, that just shows the character to me of that type of person.
That type of man, yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, anyway, getting back to your dad and, growing up as a major league player's son, how did you adjust as a boy to, I know my father and my uncles were in, an unusual occupation for the time, being stage work and Broadway work and show business, and, your dad's working when the other dads are home, and your parents are having breakfast at 2 p.m, and it's just that type of a thing. How did you adjust to all of that as a young boy?
Well, I was fortunate, I think, Tony. It was an adjustment, but from my very earliest memory, I mean, my mom said she took me to a ball game at Griffith Stadium. I was maybe 6 months old. I fell asleep in her arms, and a few years later, she said I was sitting with her at Griffith Stadium, and somebody was giving my dad a hard time, and and I told him to be quiet. That was my daddy, and don't say those kind of things. And my mother laughed. She said, well, that man was so embarrassed he never opened his mouth the rest of the game. But, you know, growing up, I was fortunate because I had the same name, played the same sport as my dad in the same area, but I also had to, you know, live up to his reputation. So I'm 11 years or 12 years old playing Little League. My dad comes to a game, and he's only been out of baseball maybe 5 years, but everybody knew who he was, and they're surrounding him for autographs and that kind of stuff. And somebody in the stands hollers at me, a 12-year-old, hey, Case, you're never going to be as good as your old man. Well, my dad was incensed, and he said to me afterwards, because I came home crying, I said, Daddy, why did they say that? And he said, don't even listen to him. Don't worry about it. Well, what happened is that my dad told me, he said, that's the last time I'm going to go watch you play baseball. He said, you know how to play. You're a good player, but I don't want to sit there, and I don't want to have people comparing you to me when I was a major leaguer and you're 12 years old playing Little League baseball. That's just ridiculous. So, you know, I was able to handle it later on. I'm playing, you know, high school and American Legion and Babe Ruth League and all that. And, you know, people would compare me to my dad, but I was a pretty good player. So that didn't bother me. But I loved the game. I loved my father. I felt proud to, you know, be his son with the same name. But I was able to handle it. And, you know, I think I was very fortunate.
Yeah, you know, it sure shows. It sure shows on you. Getting to the nub of wartime baseball. This is going back close to 30 years ago. I was in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, at my first late wife's father's house, and it was a holiday thing, and I was recently married and somewhat uncomfortable at this, you know, this strange house in this strange city. Trying to get used to people whom I had just met, and one of the older neighbors came by. Her name was Ann, and somehow the conversation got to baseball, and she looked at me, and she said, "Do you know I worked for the Philadelphia? I believe it was the Philadelphia Athletics in 1943." And were they owned by Mr. Carpenter?
Well, no, Bob Carpenter owned the Phillies.
Okay, then it was the Phillies.
Yeah.
And I said, you did? And she said, yes, it was the war, and I was a young girl, and I was in Philadelphia, and I had a job in the back office of the team. I said, wow, that's interesting. I said, I know very little about old-time ball, Ann. Can you tell me about it? She said, well, I was a big fan, but it really was very interesting because Mr. Carpenter, I think like so many owners of the day, was somewhat, shall we say, parsimonious. You know, like Ralph Kiner used to talk about Mr. Brown and Mr. Galbraith and Mr. Cheap and how all that went down. You know, when you have a monopoly, you can do whatever you want. But she said what he would make me do is every player came and got his pay envelope. They weren't dealing in checks then. Right. He would make the player sign the register and the amount of money that he received, just so there wouldn't be any funny business. I said, wow, that's really interesting. And she said, you know, I think if I go back to my house, I can find that register. I said, okay, this is becoming somewhat Rod Serling-esque. And I said, you know, if you find it, Ann, I'd love to see it. Well, sure enough, she walks down the street. Back in those days, I guess she could walk down the street and back in Baltimore and not be concerned. Yeah. 30 minutes later, she comes back with a red book that says Philadelphia Phillies on it. And every single player for every single week signed for his pay. And I'll tell you something, George, the only player I recognized in this whole panoply of all these guys that played wartime ball was Babe Dahlgren. Everybody else, I had no idea who they were.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. Now, Tony, let me tell you something about Babe Dahlgren. You know who he was. He took Lou Gehrig's.
Oh, sure.
In 1939 with the Yankees. Well, you know, Babe Dahlgren's grandson wrote a book called Rumor in Town, and it's all about Dave Dahlgren. He'd been traded so many times, was really a good player, but he was haunted, and people would follow him around because they said, he had been involved in smoking marijuana or some damn.
I did not know.
And the whole thing, was sort of ludicrous because back then, today people would just poo-poo it. They wouldn't care with what was really going on with Major League Baseball the last few years with, performance-enhancing drugs and steroids and all that kind of stuff. But back then, and it's funny you mentioned Dave Dahlgren because I can understand that. Babe had been traded to the Phillies, and he'd been with Yankees and I think Dodgers or whatever. But Babe had gone to the Phillies, and I do know this. But players used to sign. You're exactly right. They would have to. And in Washington, they did something similar. And my dad always called Clark Griffith Mr. Griffin. Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Players, the players would negotiate their contracts every year with either the club owner or with the general manager. There were no agents involved. They did one-year contracts. And, if they had agreed to play for X amount of dollars and their weekly or biweekly paycheck, they would have to sign for it to get their money. Absolutely.
Really something. Now, we kind of move forward in your life. You got involved in the athletic footwear business from what we've spoken about, and is that correct?
Yeah, it is, and I was fortunate that way too, Tony, because I graduated from Rutgers, and my dad, I had two young boys, and I played ball in high school and college, and I might have been able to make it. I don't know. I had pretty good size and good speed and that kind of thing. But my dad said, if you really want to play professional baseball, that's one thing if you were single. But you're married and you have a young family. You got to make a living, and so you try to find something that you really like. Well, I was fortunate because right out of college, I applied for a job in the athletic footwear business, had an interview. Just so happened, the first interview I had happened to be with an executive of a shoe company, and he said, "Damn," he said, "I remember your dad." He said, "I used to watch him play." Well, that sort of opened the door for me, and 35 years later, my entire career was in the athletic footwear business, and got to know, and all kinds of people, basketball, baseball, football people. And my dad had a sporting goods store after he retired, so I grew up in the sporting goods business. So it was a natural, tie-in for me to go from playing in the business, in the professional or playing side of sports to the business side of sports. So I was very fortunate in that way.
Now, I would like for you to tell the story that you told me about selling sneakers to John Wooden. We've had all these sneaker scandals today, and it's like turn on your computer TV or whatever, and yet we have another scandal. Please tell our dear audience this story of.
Well, this is an actual true story. This was in the early 70s, and I was working for Brokeheads at the time, basketball shoes, and we had come up with a new basketball shoe. So I took it upon myself. I just wrote a letter to John Wooden. And John Wooden was Coach of the Year. UCLA was in their midst of 8 or 10 national championships in a row. And he wrote back to me, and he said, "I got your letter, and I'll be very happy to put your shoe on the captain of my team," which at the time was Henry Bibby. So, I sent Henry Bibby, I think whatever size it was.
Must have been big.
A postage stamp to get the letter to John Wooden, and then whatever it cost me to send the shoes out to UCLA. Well, about a couple months later, I'm at a basketball luncheon arranged by Billy Packer, who was another friend of mine.
Yes.
Billy Packer, who's been the great player and CBS announcer and all that kind of stuff. And Billy and I became pretty good friends. Well, he arranged a luncheon meeting with myself and John Wooden. So I'm prepared to talk basketball with Coach Wooden. It just so happens that we sit down, and he said, "By the way, George," he said, "I just want to tell you something. I remembered getting your letter, and I saw your name, and I said to myself, I said, I wonder if he's related to George Case, the ball player."
Wow.
It just so happened that, and I didn't know it, John Wooden was a great baseball fan, and he and I sat there the whole luncheon, And instead of talking basketball and the great teams and his wonderful coaching philosophy about, playing basketball, we talked baseball. And I was stunned. And he said to me, the reason I responded to your letter, because I knew your name, and he said, I thought that Henry Bibby would be a good opportunity for you. Well, 2 weeks after we sent the letter, the shoes to Henry Bibby, he's on the cover of Sports Illustrated with our shoe. and all my coworkers are saying to me, how in the world did you ever do that? And I said, well, I just happened to write a letter to Coach Wooden, and this is the result of it. And they were stunned because they were trying to get exposure on our new basketball shoe and really didn't know how to do it. And it was up to me to try to do something, which I did, and it just so happens that it worked out great because a cover shot in Sports Illustrated back then, that was a major accomplishment.
Oh, that was it. That was the cat's pajamas, man.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, and you remember, not that they all were gentlemen. I mean, it's like, I think sometimes younger fans listen to the older guys talk, and they think we're in some sort of a, Candyland, if it were, and not all of them were 100% nice all of the time, and
right.
Many of them weren't, but you do remember the gentlemen, like, recently we lost Bob Wolf, who worked for the Senators, whom
yes.
we both spoke to at different times. Just such a fine gentleman, 8-decade career, and Hall of Famer in 3 sports, and called Larson's perfect game. And I remember, this is going back about, I'm going to say it's 40 years ago. We were playing Bob's son Rick, who's now a child psychologist who had a show on WFAN in New York every Sunday for years and years and years.
Right.
Rick was still playing ball on the weekends, and we were playing. It was either Connecticut, New York Colonial, or Connecticut Collegiate. I forget the exact league, but they had a very good team of minor league or ex-minor league players that still wanted to play. And I came in at the last inning to catch the relief pitcher. And it was a 1-2-3 game. And it was a game where we had beaten this very good team by a number of runs. I didn't get to bat in that game. I do remember that much. So at the end of the game, I noticed a man who looked very familiar to me. And one of my teammates had said to me, that's the announcer. And I quickly, what little math I could do in my head, okay, Rick Wolf, Bob Wolf. And I walked up to him with trepidation. I figured the worst thing the guy could do is tell me to go to hell. And I had all my catching equipment on. And I said, Mr. Wolf, I've admired you for years. And like, Mr. Wolf, it's a pleasure to meet you. This man practically hugged me. He said, thank you. Thank you for watching me. Thank you for thinking highly of my work. Congratulations on today's game. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I thought to myself, I was in shock. I just couldn't get down off of this mountain. Now, when I had interviewed him with Bob Lazari years later, I brought this up to him and I said, how are you so kind to me? And, he said, Tony, you never know who's watching. And when somebody says they actually watched or listened, you feel 10 feet tall.
Absolutely, Tony. I can appreciate that story. A wonderful story. Bob Wolf, was legendary. Just a wonderful guy. And a few years ago, you mentioned Rick Wolf. Rick Wolf saw one of my blurbs or something on Facebook, and he called me up. He said, I want to buy that DVD you have of baseball. And he said, I want to give it to my father as a Father's Day.
Oh, that's sweet.
I mean, and to me, that's Rick Wolf. And, well, I knew immediately when he said Rick Wolf, I said, well, obviously it's Bob Wolf's son. But the fact that he wanted to do that for his dad, he said, my dad will be so thrilled to be able to see a lot of those players that he would remember when he first started broadcasting. And it was, a thrill for me to be able to do that. And I got a nice note back from Rick, and he said, George, he said, my dad was absolutely thrilled to see that. Thank you very much. And I wrote back to him. I said, well, thank you. I mean, it's a great, a thrill for me to be able to do that for you.
And tell us about those DVDs, because I know they mean a lot to you.
Well, I was, a few years ago, my dad had done, a VHS tape. Actually, it was originally, they were color home movies that he took during his baseball playing career. And he'd bring them home at the end of the season and bring them in and put a screen up in our living room. And I said, Daddy, we have to watch these again? So he said, well, I just wanted to show you what I'm doing. So, later on when my father wasn't feeling too well, but I said to him one time, I said, Dad, you really should, explain to the fans today who these players are, because other than at DiMaggio or Williams or Feller, Greenberg, they probably won't have any idea who these players are. So he took it upon himself to get a tape recorder and to get a VHS tape, and he taped his comments and his remembrances of World War II baseball. Well, after my dad passed away, I thought to myself, well, let me see if I can make something of this. So I put it together in a 30-minute tape. Then a gentleman named Jim Van Koski, who was a personal friend of Mickey Vernon, said to me, called me up to George. He said, I've got Mickey's films. He said, why don't we put your dad's films and Mickey's films together, and we'll make it the story about World War II era Major League Baseball, color film of the great players during that time, and with your dad's narration and Mickey's narration, and we'll come up with a theme, and the theme was World War II era baseball. We call it from off-field to battlefield and back, from FDR to JFK. There's 4 presidents of the United States during that era. Throwing out the first ball at Griffith Stadium, Bob Feller, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, great players, Hank Greenberg, Jimmy Fox, Lefty Grove, Bill Dickey, Luke Appling, all these legendary future Hall of Famers in their prime, not as older men, but during their playing days. And it's really a behind-the-scenes look at Major League Baseball during the World War II era. Part of it is looking at the life of Major League players, not game action. So there's no game action at all. It's all about what the players did, spring training, before games, fooling around, having fun, playing golf, doing that kind of thing. What the life of a Major League player is really about, and something that most fans would never see. The only time they ever see the players during their prime, if they ever saw them play in a game or see footage of that, they don't see behind the scenes, and that's what this DVD is all about.
It's really something, and to have these treasures to look at that really are such an important part of not only our baseball history, but our national history. Now, in our closing moments together, I'd like to talk to you about how you got bitten by the broadcasting bug.
Well, you know what? It just so happened that I was asked to speak a long time ago and developed a certain, method of speaking, and people had asked me and said, well, really, why don't you do something with either radio or books or something? I said, well, I would just like to be able to talk to people if they're interested in talking to me about my dad's career or about World War II era baseball. And I've been invited to speak, and Sabre was a nice opportunity for me when I was the executive director, because it was all about baseball and baseball research. And people would call me up, and they'd ask me to speak on occasion, which I always felt very comfortable doing. So, the tendency then would be into what you're doing, say broadcasting, podcasting, whatever. And I've always enjoyed it, because if someone is interested in talking about that era, I'd be very happy to talk to them about it. My dad used to say to me, he said, now, if somebody wants to talk baseball, talk baseball. If they don't even bring up the subject. And that was a lesson I learned very early. So, in what you're doing, I really enjoy speaking with a person like yourself who has that interest and his ability to communicate that interest to, listeners all over the country.
It was almost shocking to me because I believe it was 2017 when I had called Bob Wolf's house to ask him to come on the Monday Night Sports Show. And the phone rang, and it was picked up by his wife, Jane, who's been with him forever and ever and ever. And I tried to be as polite as I could. Hello, Mrs. Wolf. This is Tony D'Angelo of Monday Night Sports. I'd like to talk to Mr. Wolf as to if he would like to guest with us at some point in the near future. Now, George, there's like 15 seconds of silence, and I'm thinking, what is happening here? And then you hear this voice, Bob, they want you to work again. It's like, I'm thinking, this man who's done everything is like, he comes to the phone. He couldn't be any more gentlemanly. He's so appreciative, and at the time we're done, he tells us both, fellas, if you need me to fill in or something, I'm always here.
No, that's wonderful. Tony, that's wonderful, really. I know, after my dad passed away, people would call me up, and they would also talk to my mother, and my mother used to tell, well, my husband passed away, and, if you really want to talk about baseball, here's my son's phone number and that kind of thing. So, I really grew up like that, and for me, it was an honor to talk about my dad and what you're saying about, calling up. If somebody called my father's house and my dad wasn't there, or if I was there and my mother would say, George, somebody wants to talk baseball. And she'd always have to say which George it was. Either George, Big George, which was me, or my son, Young George. So we had three of us, all answered to the name George. So she always had to ask or mention who it was that was going to talk on the phone. So, and my dad used to say, Helen, and I'll be happy to talk to him, but just give me a minute while I come over to the phone. And that was the kind of thing. And I remember after my dad died, I had a guy call my mother and say, oh, Mrs. Case, I'm so sorry to hear about your husband passing away. By the way, do you have any of his memorabilia? And I told my mother called me up. She says, somebody wants to talk to me about I said, you tell that person to call me. And the person called me, and I said, do me a favor. Don't call me again. I said, that's family to me.
Oh, sure.
And I am not about to do anything to dishonor my mother, my father, or our family legacy by, giving away some stuff to a baseball memorabilia collector. I said, I'm just not going to do it. So please don't bother me anymore.
Well, and I think it all speaks to the, just the reachableness of people in the past. Like I could remember, this is, in the 80s when the Brewers were playing in the postseason, and Harvey Keene, when he lived in Milwaukee, and his phone was listed, and fans would call him up, and he would talk to fans about baseball. And Tony Kubek asked him, you allow that? He says, sure. He says, sometimes they have some very good suggestions. After somebody told me where to bat Gantner, and I did it, and I actually won a game. He says, but I won't tolerate any swearing. No, that's the one thing I won't. I'll hang up on him.
Right. Again, Tony, a wonderful story, and you mentioned about phone calls. I'll just tell you a quick thing. I know you're running out of time, but Mickey Vernon and my dad and Mickey's wife and myself, my family, very, very close friends, very lifelong friends.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one time, Mickey and I were talking about this, and he said, George, he said, I always had my phone number listed in the phone book. He said, but nobody ever called me to talk to me about baseball. And I said, geez, Mick, I said, I wonder why. He said, I'll tell you why, because I had it in the phone book as James Vernon. Well, his nickname was Mickey.
Ah.
His given name was James. So he had it in the local phone book as James Vernon. Nobody put that with Mickey Vernon, and so people would not call him. And, the only ones who knew it would be like myself or family friends, because I would call him up. I'd say, Mick, this is George, or my dad, he and Mickey would talk. But I can certainly understand when you're talking about Harvey Keene. I mean, here's a great player, but he was willing to talk to people as long as what you're saying, no profanity.
No cursing. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. That's what the players would like to talk about. They don't want to hear somebody saying, well, what do you think about this? I think he's a bum. I mean, that's not what players want to hear. They want to talk to fans who have a real interest in either their career or what they think about baseball, not to get into personalities about who these players are.
It's really something, and it's just I'm very happy to have folks like you I can talk to, and my own recollections to the extent they stay in my head these days. In our closing moments together, you are broadcasting on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and you are a proponent of these DVDs. And I'm sure a lot of people would like to connect with you based upon the great guy you are and your wonderful body of knowledge. Where can they do that, George?
Well, thank you very much, Tony. What they can do, I'd be very happy to, if they want to send me an email, it's timelessbaseball@verizon.net. And that's how, that's my website, and they can go on, and it gives all the information about ordering the DVDs. We're almost sold out right now. As a matter of fact, I do have one left that I could get out right away, using PayPal. It's $29.95, and that includes shipping. So, we've sold, several thousand to fans and people all around the country who remember that era and are interested in it. So if anybody is interested in either talking to me or wants some more information about our DVD, again, my website, timelessbaseball@verizon.net.
And George, that's great. Stay on the line, if you will. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much here today for being with me on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and so grateful to have this opportunity to share.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
A blade so strong, a blade so sharp, it could only come from Wilkinson Sword, masters of the cutting edge since 1772. Now, put a sword in your razor. The Wilkinson Sword blade. Stainless steel, made in England, made like no other blade in the world for long-lasting sharpness. The Wilkinson Sword blade is Swedish chrome steel, heat-tempered at 1976 degrees, polished 16 times, inspected 22 times, stropped in costly Swiss oxhide until the shaving edge is sharpened to 17 millionths of an inch. So smooth, so flawless, so sharp, they feel it on your face. And it stays sharp, shave after shave. Put a sword in your razor. The Wilkinson Sword blade. Finest shaving edge in the world.
On the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, or in general, or my program in particular, I like to go back and look at some historical broadcasts as to what was taking place way back when. I am not a historian or an historian, to be grammatically correct, but I am a great believer in the fact that we have to understand our past in order to understand our present and our future. And baseball, and talking to a fellow like George Case, was a way different thing back then. You can argue better or worse, but certainly different. And I, every once in a while, like to see where we're at as opposed to where we were. During this somewhat of a rain delay here, I found this really incredible broadcast of the Red Barber Show in 1947, where Red had interviewed and then ailing Babe Ruth. Now, we're not going to play the whole thing, but I do want to play it to kind of give you the flavor of what these broadcasts were like during a time when radio really was the main medium. So sit back and we'll have a little fun listening to this.
Columbia presents its sports director, Red Barber. Visitor to the program today is Babe Ruth, who will discuss with the old redhead the art of playing the outfield. This is another in the series of discussions of the various positions in Red Barber's baseball clinic. But first, let's look at the sports headlines of August 12th in other years. 15 years ago, Max Carey was reappointed manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers for another year. 14 years ago, Wilbert Robinson, former Dodger manager, was chosen to succeed Charles Moore as manager of Atlanta in the Southern Association. 14 years ago, Raleigh Hemsley was sold to the Browns at the waiver price by the Cincinnati Reds. And 12 years ago, Charlie Bowser was named assistant football coach at the University of Pittsburgh. 10 years ago, Shirley Hanover won the Hambletonian in straight heats with times of 2:01 and 1/5 and 2:01 and 3/5. And 9 years ago, Wes Farrell was released by the Washington Senators. But that was years ago. Here now is Red Barber.
Hello, everybody. Babe Ruth is here as our series of programs on how to play baseball continues. Connie Mack started us off last evening with a fine discussion of how to build a batting order. And the Babe is ready to take his glove and run out to the outfield. Everybody knows of Babe Ruth, the great hitter. But not everyone knows what a tremendously fine defensive player he was. Connie Mack last evening was talking about Babe's amazing consistency in playing the outfield, that he never threw to the wrong base. Babe Ruth is a very busy man these days, and it warms our hearts that he's recovered so much of his strength from his recent throat operations. Babe is consultant, as you know, to the Ford Motor Company in cooperation with the American Legion Junior Baseball Program, and he's all over the country. For example, he's honorary chairman of the New York Journal-American Sandlot game at the Polo Grounds tomorrow evening. And Babe Didrickson's the Harriers has come in from Denver for that game, and she's here in the studio listening to the other Babe. Well, so Babe Ruth, let's go to work on how to play the outfield. And first of all, how's the throat?
Well, I tell you, Red, it's not so good. And a lot of people put me down as an outfielder, yes. I played the outfield, and as much as I can tell the young boys how to play the outfield, as knowing who the batter is in the first place. You must know if the batter's fast or not. Second, you must judge the speed of the runner, going from first to second, or from second to third, or all around the bases. Then, if a man is on first base, especially a slow man, and you got a fast man up there hitting next, and he happens to hit a ball to right field, say, for instance, which I was playing, you can always catch that fella, not always, but if you watch that slow fella at second base, you know if you got a good arm, he will not go. And a lot of times that man is supposed to be fast who hit the ball to right field. If you got your head up, you can throw that ball to first base and catch him. I'd say 7 out of 10 times, which I have done.
In other words, a lot of times, Babe, when a batter gets a little overconfident or careless and takes that big turnaround first, the right fielder, if he can throw accurately and with strength, can pick him out off first base.
Yeah, if he's got his head up, he can pick that fella. I've seen Dixie Walker do it over in Brooklyn. It's a great play, and it's a nice play to watch.
Yes, it certainly is. Well, let's see now. First of all, the outfielder has to study who the batter is, meaning where he can hit the ball, as well as his speed of foot. Then judge the running speed on the bases. And then what would you say is the next point?
Well, the fella's got to keep his head up to the extent, I would say, if a ball is hit to an outfielder, the first thing he's got to think of, as I said before, who the runner is, where they're playing, where he hits, left to right field, and so forth. Then, if the ball is hit over his head, never back up on the ball. Always run to a spot where you think the ball is coming down. Never back up. Then if you run back to the spot where you think the ball is coming down, you will be within 2 or 3 feet anyhow. And then if the ball is out of your reach, then you know it cannot be caught.
Well, Babe, how important is it for the...
Very, very interesting show, and listening to this dialogue makes you think about Babe Ruth. And here it is, it's raining here in Connecticut, and I guess it's time for a little bit of a Mel Allen rain delay, and talking about Babe Ruth, as Mel often did on the Yankee rain delay broadcast. And you wonder if Babe could have been a good manager, and there's a lot of debate on that going back and forth. Leo DeRocher didn't think much of him at all when he was coaching in Brooklyn in 1938, but yet Babe, during some of these radio broadcasts and in the series of films that he made in the early 1930s, seemed to have quite an affinity for the game. So, I guess that's kind of like a lot of the other historical unanswered questions, such as would JFK had escalated Vietnam, or would Martin Luther King have been for affirmative action or against it? Would Babe have been a great manager? We're certainly not going to know while we're on this earth. We can draw our own conclusions. But that's a whole lot of fun. That's really what makes baseball a whole lot of fun. And I do understand, actually, in taking this to today's game, that there's a lot of fans who are unhappy with their team's performances of late. Maybe if you're an Indians fan last night, or you're a Yankee fan, or you're a Dodger fan, you feel a little bit of shame. Well, the Magic Lanterns sang a song in 1968 talking about shame. Let me tell you, kids, it's only a game. As Joe Garagiola told us, Tykes, on the Game of the Week, it is specifically designed to break your heart. Have fun, watch some games, listen to some great music. It's a privilege that many people do not have in many parts of the world. We'll be back to you right after this. People that know me know I am a huge WABC radio top 40 fan from way back, and recently we lost Dan Ingram. Kind of a sad spot in many of our hearts, but Dan Ingram was famous for doing the word of the day. And I would like to continue to honor that tradition by doing the Dan Ingram word of the day. And that word is slimsy. And slimsy is something somebody tries to do when they have to lose 30 pounds in a hurry for a given big event. Anyway, it is time for the charge jingle. Many people to thank here. Special thanks go out to Red Barber, Babe Ruth, Wilkinson blades. Believe me, kids, I use them, not for the faint of heart. Our esteemed and honored guest, George Case, and ultimately the real stars of this broadcast, our friends and fans up and down the networks and stations of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm so honored to be doing this broadcast, and I'm so happy to be being here, and so happy that so many people have fun enjoying what takes place here, and it really is a treat for me. So with that, and we'll be running around here, and we'll be having some fun next week, and I am so happy. I can't tell you. This is really a treat for me. And I cannot really contain my excitement for next week's show. Biggest part of it is you're going to be here, and you're going to make it a very special broadcast. So with that, as Dan Ingram would say, Keuskade, we're going to see you next Saturday here on Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. Take care. God bless. Thanks for being with us. Bye now.